So Dabo Swinney's pissed. He's not happy with Ole Miss, Pete Golding, Luke Farrelly, who was a transfer that entered the portal from Cal, a linebacker, committed to Clemson. Apparently got, rented a car, was in classes, place to stay, committed to Clemson. Everything was fine. But apparently he
hadn't signed his NIL deal or whatever, correct?
Yeah.
He didn't sign off on that.
Apparently he did.
Did he? Did it? Because I wasn't sure if he had signed any paperwork for his NIL deal.
It was pretty official.
Was it complete?
I mean, it seemed like it.
Right.
And so all of a sudden he re-entered the portal. Now he's at Ole Miss. And people are wondering, because it kind of put Clemson in a bad spot because he was going to be a big addition to the linebacker room. And by the time he re-entered the portal, everything had pretty much dried up. And so Dabo Swinney was peeved about that. And he detailed the recruitment of Luke Farrelly by Ole Miss over the weekend.
Sorrells met with Luke face-to-face in his office. And Luke communicated that Pete texted him on Wednesday morning, the head coach at Ole Miss, when he was in his 8 a.m. class. And he said the text message said, "I know you're signed. What's the buyout?" Coach Golding also texted him a picture of a $1 million contract. Luke also mentioned to Jordan that Coach Golding had Trinidad Chambliss call him from his phone, and that Coach Golding was there continuing to talk on his phone to push him to re-enter the transfer portal. He also said that Jackson Dart had reached out and called him. There's tampering, and then there's blatant tampering. Tampering 101 is when you're talking to kids who aren't in the portal. Tampering 201 is when you've already negotiated the deal with the kids not in the portal. Tampering 301 is when you got a kid who's gone in the portal, signed somewhere, moved there, gone to classes, and you're texting them while they're in class. That's like a whole nother level of tampering, and it's total hypocrisy.
So,
I think this is one of the reasons, though, why Dabo didn't want to deal with this in the past, because a number of things. I mean, they might not have been, financially viable or able to compete in that way, but also because you subject yourself to all of this. I mean, if you want to get involved in the game, you're going to realize it's the Wild Wild West. It's nasty. There's no one really truly enforcing any sort of punishment for all of this. It's egregious. And by the way, this has gone on before NIL became a thing. I mean, there were teams trying to get players off rosters way back when, and they would, entice them with money under the table. So this isn't new. I think the frustration for Dabo and a lot of other coaches it's supposed to be all above board, all very transparent. And even when it is, there's still people who are cheating or bending the rules. And there's really no form of punishment outside of outing them. Is that a fairest way of putting it?
Yes. That's a fair way of putting it.
I would have a hard time. Because I understand Dabo's frustration. Because, he mentioned, he brought up the NIL stuff that you talked about. A couple years ago. That's why Nick Saban bailed, Hafley left Boston College, Chip Kelly bailed. I just think that there's some guys that look at this and go, I don't want to be a part of this. And I don't think he's not for long in this current landscape. It feels like the clock is ticking. There were people out, calling for his job because of how disappointing they were last year. I would just have a hard time as a coach dealing with the fact that we think we've got a guy, we think he's already in class, and Dabo's got to sit up there and read text messages back and forth. And then, the AD for Ole Miss, after they reached out and said, "Hey, can you tell him to stop reaching out to our kid and showing him screenshots of $1 million contract?" And the AD at Ole Miss was like, "Listen, I'll tell him, but Pete does what he wants to do." It's just the whole thing is bananas that this stuff goes on.
Till there's enough rules to govern these types of things taking place, everybody's going to have to deal with this new landscape. And I don't know. Again, I told y'all, I see how these guys are recruiting and how they're they're looking at, scouting, pre-games and stuff like that on the fields, and how blatant it is that, the way they're breaking down and looking at the players on the opposite teams. It is a new day and age. And within this new day and age, how do you navigate it properly? And I would offer this. I would say, at the risk of sounding kind of corny, it's never been more relevant to recruit a kid from a good family than ever now. And I don't know the kid Forelli. I don't know what type of family background he has, family history, but I do know in simpler times, a man taught his son to honor your word. If I made the deal and I shook your hand, that was a deal. And we move with the deal. If we sign a contract, we signed the contract, honor the contract, deliver your deliverables, be a man about it. I think that this is one of those moments where if the dollar is going to continue to win out, maybe the only chance you have, and I look at what took place with Indiana this year and how they had no stars players on their team and how they were able to go undefeated and win a national title. And by the way, against a team in the national title game that was a high NIL spending team. By the way, against an Ohio State team, which was a high NIL spending team. I think at some point you have to start understanding who you are recruiting, what type of person they are, what type of people they are, where they come from, what type of family. And that has to be more of what you're looking into, the value of them as people, not just the value of what they bring to the table athletically as a football player. And that might be the only sensible approach, because otherwise you're just going to be in the rat race with everybody else who's offering these top players, money and benefits.
So what's changed in the past, 10 years, 20 years? And you'd say, well, NIL, because now these guys are able to make, some of these players have always made money. Like, that's the dirty truth to everything, is there's been programs, there's been schools that have paid players, regardless of whether or not it was legal, and we call it name, image, and likeness, or there are collectives created for it. It's always been this way. There's always been players who are paid under the table to go to one school versus another. And it's interesting that now that it's become above board, there's certain institutions now that are succeeding, and there's others who are falling more by the wayside. Or I'll just say that the landscape has been leveled off. I'll leave it at that. To me, the biggest issue with everything that's going on in college sports, and basketball is kind of its own animal, so I'm not going to include basketball, even though it still plays a role. It's the transfer portal. The fact that all these kids are able to every single year test out their market rate, their marketability. It leads to so many, I think, issues, short-term and long-term. There is no commitment more than a year. And that commitment is purely based on financials in most cases. I mean, if you took away the ability for these student athletes to transfer year over year, the decision-making process looks a lot different on the way in. And even once they do decide to transfer, whether it's they get one free opportunity to transfer and then the next they're penalized, they have to sit out a year, or however you go about conjuring that up. Maybe you just state it within the contract and you make big buyouts, et cetera, et cetera. However you go about doing it. My whole general point to this is there is no commitment. There's people who are trying to constantly, improve the roster. And by the way, even back when there was a penalty to sit out for a year, what ended up happening then was the NCAA was getting abused with all these different claims by players, and they'd have, law firms represent them in this, to say it was a hardship waiver. That was the quote unquote, that was the way they went about around it before the transfer portal didn't penalize them and sit them out a year. So then they did create a hardship waiver. And how'd that work? Well, they could make any claim they want, and no one's ever gonna, question it. And for the most part, they all got approved, especially if it looked like it was a professionally prepared argument that they can't be at that school anymore. They need to go somewhere else. So they get a hardship waiver and they show up at the next school and they're immediately eligible. So even that was skirted to go around the issue with all that. And so I look at it and just say, if you found a way to make kids at least commit to going someplace, getting their degree, or maybe that's what it would be about. Maybe you say, if we still want to make education a strong component of this, say the kid's got to graduate. And until you graduate, you can't transfer penalty free. And there's no hardship waiver, none of that BS. You got to actually commit. You got to go to a place, whatever contract you sign on the way in, that's where you're going to be at. And then maybe unless there's a coaching change, you can then say, okay, now we can open up to look elsewhere. But until that's the case, like, this is where you're going. And you need to graduate. Once you get your degree, transfer as many times as you want. You got 2 years left of eligibility, 3 years. I mean, some of these kids come in with a year of school almost already done nowadays. And with summer school and everything else, they can graduate in 3 years. I mean, how I did it in 3.5 basically when I was in college. That was forever ago. So that to me is still the bigger issue with all of this, is the ability for all these kids to transfer at will and not make any commitment, at least not more than a year. I think that plays a huge role.